Everyone. Hopefully everyone is inspired by that nice musical interlude to kick us off today. I'm Deidre Cruz. I'm on behalf of our Center for Health Equity's director, Dr. Lisa Cooper, who couldn't be with us today. As a deputy director, I'd like to welcome you all to our March edition of our Health Equity Jam session. We are thrilled that you all are able to tune in today. I know it's spring break for the Johns Hopkins students, and I understand also UCLA, where our guest speaker is joining us, is also having spring break right now as well. So we're especially delighted that you were able to tune in. So terrific. So we are going to get started with our special way that we like to introduce our speakers. I'll start with maybe a little bit of a traditional intro, and then we'll jump into the way that we enjoy introducing our speakers, which is surrounding their fun facts. So today we're delighted to have Dr. Gilbert G, or Dr. Gil G, who is a professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the Fielding School of Public Health at UCLA. Dr. G received his bachelor's degree in neuroscience from Oberlin College and his doctorate in health policy and management from Johns Hopkins. Some of you actually may know him from his time at Hopkins. And he did a postdoctoral training program in sociology at Indiana University. His research has focused on social determinants of health inequities of racial, ethnic, and immigrant minority populations using a multi-level and life course perspective in his work. And his primary line of research is focused on conceptualizing and measuring racial discrimination and also understanding how discrimination may be related to illness. He's published very broadly on topics including those surrounding stress, neighborhood factors, immigration, environmental exposures, occupational health, and also widely on the experience of Asian American populations. And so that's our formal introduction. The informal part involves our fun facts. And so today, even though it's spring break, we're gonna go to school a little bit, and I'm gonna offer up a couple of multiple choice questions for you all. And I invite you to use the chat feature to try to answer this. So I'm gonna start first with Dr. G's hobby that he was gracious enough to share with us that he engages in. So is Dr. G's hobby, I'm gonna give 4 choices. So is it A, oil painting, B, playing tennis, C, woodworking, or D, cooking? We'll see. Let's see, we're getting a few answers. Let's see what the general consensus is here. Okay. It's looking like it's looking kind of like a 3-way tie between, it's looking like cooking, woodworking, some people saying tennis, maybe even with tennis as a question mark. All right, Dr. G, do you want to fill us in on what the real answer is?
Well, this is funny because I had given Deidre sort of one little story, and then she turned it into this wonderful little multiple choice. Actually, most of those can apply, except for oils. But the one I would offer you is woodworking. It's a hobby I picked up a few years ago because like many of us as academics, we spend all day in front of a computer and work with abstract ideas and really have to delay our gratification. And for me, I really wanted something that was tangible, I could create, use a different part of my brain. And every now and then I make like a table or something, but probably more often than not, I make accidental firewood.
So what, well, we hope that you stay safe in your hobby. This is for sure. One comment, Dr. Cujo noted that it had to be woodworking because look at the shelves behind you. Did you, is that your handiwork?
No, that's a virtual background. See, I'll probably disappear. You see my art?
Yes, okay. Well, very good. Okay. Oh yeah. Well, sorry, I fell for it, Thomas. You said you're just kidding there. All right. So thanks for that. So our second sort of interesting fact. I don't even know if we'll call this one fun, but this is an interesting fact. Um, so unfortunately, during the time when Dr. G was a graduate student at Hopkins, he was walking to his car and had someone appear and say, "Give me your wallet." And so the next set of multiple choice answers that you all are going to be offered will be what we're asking for here is if you can tell us how you think he got out of that situation. Okay. So choice A, he said, please go away, and the situation just resolved itself. Choice B, he fought the assailant. Choice C, he ran briskly and was able to get away. In choice D, he was able to run and actually hide and have the assailant, not be able to find him and sort of escape being robbed. So which do you think it was? You can go in the chat. Okay, so some people said fight. Some people said that Dr. G ran. You're remembering our training that we've received here. Someone just noted that he just didn't give his wallet up. Dr. Marsteller says he talks his way out of it. Okay. All right. Dr. G, fill us in. What happened in this situation?
Yeah, I was a grad student in my early 20s, I guess at the time. And yeah, I walked south from the Hampton building. My car was parked, and this guy just came out of nowhere. And I said, "Go away." I looked him square in the eyes, and I was probably peeing in my pants, but he may have not. At least I faked it enough that he probably didn't see it. And I said it a few times. I mean, and I felt very lucky that eventually he said a couple of curse words to probably save face because he might have had some friends hanging out. But he just went, and I got in my car and I left, and was thankful that everything was okay. But it could have gone south really quickly, and I would have given up my wallet if he really started to approach and be demanding. So. Yeah.
So an incredible story. So for those that said, yeah, that he talked his way out of it, that was exactly accurate. So we're grateful that it turned out well. So thank you for playing along with this. We're gonna turn the floor over to you, and I should say maybe as we allow you to share your screen here, I've had the pleasure of recently getting to work more with Dr. G, whose work I've admired for years. But working on developing a measure of structural racism in collaboration with Dr. Sarah Zanton, and Dr. Roland Thorpe at Hopkins. So we've gotten to connect very recently in that work, and so really excited that you're able to join us today, and looking forward to hearing from you. I will let you share your screen.
All right. Yeah, this is great. It's such a pleasure to be back, virtually to my alma mater and to be amongst friends. The roots go deep. I think Janice actually gave me comments on my dissertation proposal at one point. So this is really cool. Okay, let me pull my slides up. Hopefully you can see this. Okay, great. Feel free to jump in at any time if you have questions. I probably won't see the chat or anything like that, so you'll have the mic on and just say something. All right. So today I'm going to talk about structural racism. As many of you know, there's been a lot of discussion nowadays about racism as a public health crisis and so forth, and a lot of attention to structural racism. And I think the phrase is oftentimes used interchangeably with institutional racism. And I actually want to offer up a distinction between the two concepts because I think they'll help the field in terms of moving forward on how to do the research and how to think about this. So I'll take as my point of departure, Healthy People 2030. As you know, this is our nation's health planning document, and there's definitely a focus on health equity. And according to Healthy People, in order to do that, we have to focus on the historical and contemporary injustices that create these inequities and disparities in the first place. And of course, we can't really talk about equity without talking about social justice, and we can't talk about social justice without talking about racism. Now, what's important about thinking about racism is that it occurs at multiple levels. And one of the first groups of scholars that have tried to articulate this was Carmichael and Hamilton when they wrote about their influential book, Black Power. And they talked about how racism is not just interpersonal experiences, but also very much a matter of how we do business. It's the structure and how society is built up. I want to extend an analogy to thinking about this. A lot of times when you talk to people about racism, they'll talk about microaggressions and they'll talk about hate crimes. And don't get me wrong, microaggressions and hate crimes are certainly important, but they are really the tip of the iceberg. And what sits beneath the surface is this much larger bolus of structural and institutional racism. And I would posit that we won't really make durable inroads into health equity until we really look beneath the surface. This multi-level understanding of race and race relations fits really nicely into a multi-level understanding of health, right? So I think you're all familiar with Bronfenbrenner's model, so I won't belabor the point, but we know that health is produced by multiple factors at multiple levels, and so are racial problems. And so one way we could think about this is, well, what are the effects of civil rights interventions? So here is some data from Doug Almond, an economist, and what you have on the x-axis is calendar year, starting from 1946. The y-axis is the post-neonatal infant mortality rate. This red line represents the infant mortality rate for white babies. And you can see that from 1946 to the 70s, it's trending downwards as you would expect. Now, if you take a look at this green line, this represents the mortality rates for Black babies in Illinois. And you can see that there's essentially an inequality at the early period of 1946. It widened slightly, but starting in 1965, there's an inflection point where it starts to trend downward. And if we look at the blue line, that's Mississippi, Black babies in Mississippi. You can see that there's a much bigger disparity at base with a much stronger widening and then a much stronger decline post 1965. And their conclusion is that this really represents a causal effect of desegregation of hospitals as related to the civil rights movement. And you can see that the disparity has declined quite steeply in that period. Other research has sort of implicated the same ideas. So here's a study by George Kaplan where they looked at life expectancy years by race in the decade prior to 1965 and then the decade afterwards. And you can see that there's a marked improvement in life expectancy for Black women and Black men, and much greater increases compared to white men and women. Now, the thing is, if we take a longer term look at these trends, they don't seem so staggering and durable like we do in the short term. So here is life expectancy by race from 1900 to 2010. And the red band in the middle represents the 60s to 70s. And you can see, of course, that there's a trending increase in life expectancy for both races in this case. You do see a bit of a closing of the gap over time, but we don't see these remarkable changes that you necessarily saw in the earlier graphs. And if we look at a more focused outcome, such as heart disease mortality, here we have the rates for Black and white adults, and you can see that there's essentially parity from 60 to 1970 or so, but then there's suddenly a gap that starts to increase. Okay, why does this happen? Well, I offer you some thoughts from Derek Bell, where he says that even these Herculean efforts we hail as successful will produce no more than temporary peaks of progress, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. So essentially what they're saying is we do see some short-term improvements related to these interventions, if you will, related to civil rights, but essentially white supremacy maintains the status quo and will somehow kind of reshift all of our inequalities back to the equilibrium of inequality. Now, we have made some inroads in thinking about how institutions play a role in this. And so here, for example, after the civil rights promulgations in the 60s, we, of course, outlawed racial residential segregation. And as part of that, we encountered another problem, right? If you're trying to integrate neighborhoods, one of the major problems that happens is that community members don't have the capital to buy homes and renovate them. So, of course, we have to get mortgages. But the problem is, of course, banks were redlining neighborhoods so that these, members of the community could not get mortgages and buy homes and so forth. And members of the community realized that this was a major problem. So in 1975, some new legislation was passed, including the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which mandated that banks and other lenders collect information on race, gender, and so forth, so as to monitor civil rights. So this is actually highly unusual. It's one thing to promulgate policies that promote civil rights, but it's actually quite rare to mandate the collection of data. But we can actually leverage this so that you can actually look at your Bank of America down the street to see if that bank is discriminating against minority borrowers. And so using the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, the HMDA data, actually I used this data in my dissertation where I was trying to look at the behavior of a specific institution, i.e. banking, to see if that kind of discrimination by one industry was related to health amongst Chinese Americans. And this was a multi-level study where we also looked at people's reports of discrimination. So this kind of investigation of looking at the behavior of specific institutions like banking or medical care or education or policing is something we need to do more of and continue to do. And certainly many people have been working in this front. So for example, Mark Hetzenbiller has been looking at immigration and homophobic policies as one way. Other people have been doing similar work as well. Including in the arena of law enforcement and mass incarceration, right? And so this presents an interesting problem to us. If you look at this book by Michelle Alexander, the title is very telling, The New Jim Crow, right? And essentially what's happened is that the segregation of neighborhoods that became outlawed was really kind of transformed into segregation of people of color, not across neighborhoods, but into prisons as another place to kind of segregate our communities. We in health can, of course, do these studies where we estimate the association of, say, imprisonment on health outcomes like morbidity and mortality. But this very simple model that many of us work on, including myself, is really not exactly reality, right? Because we know the prison system is connected to courts, we know it's connected to policing, we know it's connected to schools, we know it's connected to employment, and so forth. And so it's really this idea that there's this network of institutions that work together, and that really forced many scholars like Barbara Reskin to really take a more system science approach to really thinking about racial inequality. So, and I think this is really where we need to go as a field to not only think about the work of individual institutions like banking, but how these institutions are connected. And many people like Zinzi Bailey has talked about this, how structural racism is really about these interconnected institutions. And so to talk about that, I want to offer a different analogy, Buckyball. Buckminster fullerene, it's essentially 60 carbon atoms arranged into the form of a soccer ball. This, as you may know, is the fourth form of carbon. Other famous forms of carbon include diamond, for example, and graphite. This buckyball, I think, is a good starting point to have an analogy for understanding structural racism. If you think of each carbon atom, i.e. the little black circles, as an institution, like banking, housing, and so forth, okay? And the bonds that hold them together. Imagine first a soccer ball. When you kick the soccer ball, the ball momentarily deflects, but seconds later, it reverts back to its natural shape as a sphere. Right? And why that happens is because the forces exerted on that one point in the sphere gets distributed across the entire structure. Same thing I would posit for structural racism. When we intervene on any one institution like housing, the forces of racism get shifted so that we essentially have a new Jim Crow, that, you know, the forces of racism gets shifted to another institution. That's why when we talk about interventions such as defund the police, as important as focusing on anti-Black violence perpetuated by law enforcement is, you know, we have to remember that part of the reason why the police can get away with some of those actions is because the courts have their back, the DA's office can have their back, and other institutions can protect the institution of policing. And so the forces get shifted around, and at the end of the day, not much changes in terms of changing the status quo. And so I think it's really important for us as a field to really start to understand how we can understand the totality of these systems and the interconnections across them. And so today I want to talk about that along with something called racialized rules. We can borrow methods from social network analysis. I'm sure there are network analysis experts in this room. I would offer you a little bit of research from some of the literature. This is one study that was done some time ago where they were looking at white supremacist networks on the internet and how they're connected together. Probably not surprisingly, skinheads and neo-Nazis are connected together. But you can also see other institutions like publishing, books, and music also are part of this web of maintaining white supremacy, right? And if you're not aware of this, there's actually a lot of literature and a lot of music to kind of help propel the movement of many white supremacists. Here's another study where they looked at the network structure of online networks in Italy, I believe. And here again, you can see, of course, neo-Nazis and skinheads connected together, but so are publishers, political parties, music groups, and so forth. And here's a study that came out a couple years ago where they're using data from Twitter, and each node represents somebody who tweets, and then who the other nodes represent people who are retweeting what they say, and those blacked out faces are actually people. And you can see how these networks are starting to develop in terms of certain kinds of hate speech on the internet. So I think this gives us at least one way to start thinking about, taking a step up from individuals to thinking about institutions and how institutions are connected together and the bonds that hold them together. Certainly, we can look at the flow of money, the flow of information, informal and formal contracts, and part of those informal practices are these racialized rules. Rules are really important. And many race scholars have talked about this. So Eduardo Bonilla Silva, for example, talks about how racism provides the rules for perceiving and dealing with other people. And Chandra Ford and colleagues have talked about how us in science, our discipline's norms help to reinforce existing racial hierarchies. And let me give you an example of that. One example related to racial sorting, and then I'll talk a little bit about racialized algorithms. So here I have a screenshot from the US Census, right? And this is something that we're all familiar with. This is a population count. But my question that I have for all of you is, how is this table arranged? Is it sorted alphabetically? No. Is it sorted by population size? No. Is it sorted by who was on this land first? No. I think it's sorted by our implicit notions of which groups matter in discussions of race in the United States. And in this case, whites are quite literally on top. This is a very predictable table one that we would also use in our research studies, right? So here's a paper I randomly grabbed from HAPH. And again, it's this very predictable ordering of groups in table one of this study. And again, it's not sorted by sample size. It's not sorted alphabetically. It's not even sorted by the dependent variable, the vaccine uptake rate. It's sorted again by this very predictable pattern of which groups we implicitly think matter in our conversations. And it plays itself out in very subtle ways. So what I want to call your attention to here is the concordance between the title and the data, okay? So in this case, the title says African Americans and Hispanics are most likely to be uninsured. And when you look at the bar chart, you know, African Americans and Hispanics are the least insured. If we look at this other graph, Hispanics and African Americans are called out in the title. And again, if you look at the bar charts, it's Hispanics and African Americans. Now, when we look at this graph about confidence about receiving good care in the future, the two groups that are the least confident are Asians and Hispanics. But now suddenly the words shift very subtly. It says minorities. If we were to use parallel sentence structure with the two preceding graphs, we would of course say Asian Americans and Hispanics are less confident, right? And if we take another look in terms of satisfaction with quality of care, the two groups that are least satisfied are Asians and Hispanics, but there's no mention of race here. And I think part of what's going on is this implied notion of the only groups that suffer some kind of racial inequality or disadvantage here are African Americans and Hispanics. And when our data don't comport with that sort of way of thinking, then we get into this uncomfortable space of not really knowing what to say. And also it butts heads against this idea that Asian Americans are a model minority and have no issues to worry about. And so I think that's part of the reason why we get into this discordance in these very subtle ways of thinking about the racial hierarchy. I'll give you another more recent example from COVID. This is data from the EPIC study. Don't take these rates as truth because, as we all know, all the numbers keep changing on a regular basis. But what I do want to do is point out this same issue that we have here. In the call-out text, it says overall Black, Hispanic, and Asian patients had higher rates of infection. And if you look at this, of course, Black, Hispanic, and Asians certainly have higher caseload rates compared to whites. But if you look at this next one, where it basically says, oh, I'm missing the text at the top, but you can see that if you look at the risk of hospitalization and death amongst the EPIC patients, the blue bar represents Asian patients, and they actually have the highest rates. But again, we don't have that call out in parallel fashion that we saw with the other graph that we had there. Okay. So, and this plays itself out in other ways. And so let me give you an example from a study that was published a couple years ago where they're looking at environmental exposures amongst children in the Bay Area. And the survey that they gave asked pretty standard questions. What race do you consider your child to be? Do you consider your child to be Hispanic? And these answers are recorded verbatim. And because many of the children were biracial, they had to figure out what to do with it. And they opted to use a hierarchical approach to create a single mutually exclusive group for analysis purposes, right? So what they did is they invoked the one drop rule so that if the child was, say, Black and Korean, the child was recoded as only Black. If the child was, say, Mexican and Korean, then the child was coded as Mexican. Finally, if the child was Korean and white, the child was considered Asian and white, and so forth. My phone is going crazy today. All right. Now, the thing is, if you keep reading that paper, they had this interesting observation saying, compared to the general population in the Bay Area, our sample had greater representation of Hispanics and Blacks and fewer Asians. Well, when I read this, I thought, well, duh, you actually introduced this bias in your sample because of how you chose to code race for biracial children, right? And so these implied notions follow us across our, not only how we construct table 1, but even into our SAS code and so forth. Okay. So this is part of our implied notion of how we do work. And these kinds of notions follow us across various institutions. In another format, in terms of algorithms, I'm sure many of you have been following the literature about racial correction factors in clinical work, in cardiology, endocrinology, and so forth. And certainly there's been a lot of questioning about whether these correction factors are useful, valid, reliable, and so forth. And if you haven't read Lundy Braun's book, Breathing Race into the Machine, it's a great book. I definitely recommend it. It's about the history of the spirometer, which is, as you probably know, a machine that essentially looks at your lung capacity, your ability to breathe and expel air, and so forth. And if you, for example, I randomly picked the spirometer off Amazon, and if you look at the user's guide in the appendix, you'll see here that there's an African ethnic correction factor. You multiply some value by 0.88. And this seems to be commonplace clinical practice, and it also follows us into research. The problem is, not everybody knows that these practices actually have very racist origins. And I want to tell us a little bit about that. So if we go back to 1851, Samuel Cartwright wrote, "It is not only in the skin that a difference of color exists between the Negro and the white man, but in the membranes, the muscles, the tendons, and all the fluids and secretions. The reason for this is founded on unalterable physiological laws." Now, this is exactly the opposite of saying that race is a social construct. It is saying that race is an intrinsic, natural thing that happens because racial groups are different. He also goes on to say, under the compulsive power of the white man, they, as in Black slaves, are made to labor or exercise, which makes the lungs perform the duty of vitalizing the blood more perfectly. What is he saying here? Well, let me give you the context, right? So part of the thinking of this is to justify slavery. The thought process at the time was that Black-skinned people were constitutionally inferior, and left to their own devices, they would ultimately degenerate and die and kill themselves off. So what he is saying here is that slavery is good for Black people because the white slave owners make Black people exercise and therefore improve their lives, life expectancy, and so forth. I know this is stupid, it makes no sense, but this was part of the rationale. And part of the thinking. And an important observation here was that Samuel Cartwright was not really a kook. He was actually part of the medical mainstream. This kind of thinking bled its way into other forms of research. So, for example, here is a quote from a study published in JAMA about the Tuskegee syphilis study. And, part of the text talks about this racial influence, of course, justifying studying the prognosis of Tuskegee of syphilis amongst Black men. But what's very interesting here for our purposes today is the text where they say a lessened threshold value of symptoms. So here we're starting to introduce statistical thinking, right? So first there's this notion that racial differences are innate and biological and not mutable. And secondly, now we're starting to connect it with sort of the statistical thinking. Because once you start thinking about threshold values, you start thinking about inflection points, and you can think about a graph, and it bends at some point, and so forth. And that leads us into all these different kinds of thresholds and correction factors. Here's one example from a study where they're trying to estimate creatinine concentrations using data from NHANES. And if you go to the tables, essentially there's a lot of equations that look something like this. And so essentially the idea here is you multiply out things like age to correct for age, and height, you multiply that out, and that 0.18b is the correction factor for blacks. If you go to this article and you look at its citation stream, if you just look at the bibliography and just keep going backwards, you'll notice that this 0.18 actually comes from an odds ratio that they found in another study that just happened to produce a value, an odds ratio that was different between blacks and whites. But the study was not designed to test race differences, but it was conveniently slapped into here. And because it's part of this fancy looking equation, we take that as truth, right? And as justification, if you look at what the authors say, they actually have some very interesting writing about this. They wrote, a racial correction factor is introduced to account for the higher lean body mass and creatinine excretion rate of non-Hispanic Black participants. But no factor is needed. No factor, if needed, is available for other NHANES ethnicity groupings. For example, Mexican American and other Hispanic adults and children. Ethnicity, like race, is self-reported and alone is not expected to have a major influence on musculature. So the argument here is that the lean body mass differences between blacks and whites are the rationale for having some kind of correction factor, and race is self-reported, and ethnicity is self-reported, but we're not going to do it for ethnicity like people from Mexican descent because it's not expected to have a major influence. You see how the writing is really uncomfortable and convoluted? And I think this kind of awkwardness is there because the authors themselves recognize that they don't really have a handle on how to think about this, right? And because they themselves feel uncomfortable because they realize that there's sort of a logical error here in their thinking, they're just kind of doing a lot of hand waving. And it's interesting that the editors and peer reviewers did not call them out on that, maybe because of the power of fancy equations and numbers. Okay. So, but these kinds of practices are in other places. So for example, let me just skip this example for the sake of time, but it's happening in neuroscience and so forth as well. Okay, these kinds of correction factors are in clinical practice, during research, during, say, facial recognition algorithms, or in our billing systems, they're in our target advertising, judicial awards, predictive policing, and so forth. They're kind of everywhere in everyday practice. I'll give you another example, and I'll call your attention to Algorithms of Repression by Noble. If you go to Google Images and you type the word professor, you will get a screenshot that looks something like this. What's the common denominator here, right? I would wager that the image of a professor generally doesn't represent the people on this call, on the Zoom call at all, right? It's more apt to provide a picture not only of a white male, but you're more likely to see a white male boy than you are to see an African-American female professor, right? And so these algorithms on something as innocent as a search engine help reinforce our notions of race, of gender, and so forth. And that's why these are, in some sense, algorithms of repression. You may have read the Obermeyer article about algorithms used by an HMO. If you haven't seen it, it's a great piece. And I won't go into it in detail, but we could talk about it. But essentially, it was a billing system in a major hospital system, and how they essentially made some decisions on how they decided to triage patients on a cost basis led to an inequality for Black patients compared to white patients. And when instead they just kind of tweaked the algorithm to not be based on cost, but based on actual health problems, the racial disparity disappeared. So lots of industries, lots of institutions use these algorithms. Let me start to connect the dots a little bit more. And to do that, I want to go to Frederick Hoffman, who was a statistician working at Prudential Insurance in 1896. He produced this 300-page volume on race traits and tendencies of the American Negro. 300 pages written in 1896 with lots of data, lots of tables. Here, for example, you have data from various wards across the country. You have population counts, you have mortality rates by race. There's a mortality ratio that he calculated. Remember, this is the 1800s when he had to collect all the data by hand and do all the calculations by hand. This was even before, we would use cards, right? and Fortran programming and on our Unix machines. So he had to do all this by hand, 300 pages of data. Not only that, but he was ahead of his time looking at land values and so forth by race. This was, in many ways, a phenomenal piece of work, right? Death rates and so forth. Now, here's the thing. Doing this on behalf of Prudential was not necessarily completely benign. And what happened was that Prudential sent this message out to their policyholders. Remember, this is an insurance agency. What they wrote was the sum payment assured will be 1/3 less than now granted for the same weekly premium. These changes are made in consequence of the excess mortality in the class above named, i.e. Black persons, and they don't apply to other persons. So what is going on here? Prudential basically wrote to their Black policyholders saying, you know what? Unfortunately, Black people are dying a lot and they're costing us money. So your premium to us is going to be the same, but you know what? When you die, we're essentially going to pay you 1/3 less. And by the way, this is not going to happen to whites or to other people, right? So here we're using statistics, we're using data to justify economic inequality by race. And so this kind of practice of essentially correcting a racial correction factor in these payouts is used in many other places. So I'll give you an example. And before I talk about this specific slide, a little bit of backstory, right? So imagine you are a judge, and what happens is a child dies, and you are trying to determine how much the family gets from the death of this child. So oftentimes what they'll do is they'll get actuarial tables and they'll say, well, you know what, let's calculate the expected lifetime earnings of this child, assuming that the person lives to $1 million, and let's say this is a white boy, age 65, and assuming this is a white boy, we'll pay out $1 million, right? Oh, but you know what? It's a girl, not a boy who died, and we know that women make 75 cents to the dollar, so we should actually adjust this for the lower earnings of women over time. So instead of paying $1 million out, we would only pay $750,000. Oh, and it's a Black girl? Well, we know that Black women make a lot less than white men, and let's say it's 65%. So rather than paying out $1 million to the white boy, if we had a Black girl, we may pay only $650,000. This is something that actually plays out in judicial awards on a fairly regular basis. And so here, this was a survey done of the people who actually make these calculations, the forensic economists. So a survey of the National Association of Forensic Economists in 2009 posed this hypothetical question: assuming you're estimating the losses of a 2-year-old Black boy, what data would you use to estimate the losses? And 48% said they would only use gender. So whether it was a boy or girl, mattered, but whether it was black or white or Asian or whatever did not matter. Only 0.5% would only use race and ignore data. And you might think this is good news, but about 44% would use both race and gender. So it mattered that it was a boy, and it mattered that, or a girl, and it mattered whether what race that person was. And this was in 40-something%, and only 8% would not use such data. Maybe even more interesting are the qualitative responses from the same survey panel. One of the economists said, "It's our role to be scientists and to bring to bear the best available data. To fail to use gender and race-specific data is to make political correctness more important than science." Right? So he's saying that as an objective scientist, researcher, I just have to go with the data say, and if the data say that black boys are making less money than white boys, that's what I have to do. I'm not trying to make this a political issue, etc. I'm just kind of going with the numbers. But this was not a view shared by all of the economists. Here's another response. I would only use the data for white males, as they are the only cohort that did not suffer any past gender or race bias in hiring, and consequently did not continue the negative impact of past gender or race bias, right? And so here, this is somebody who's an economist who explicitly says that I don't want to be part of this racist and sexist practice and continue to promulgate these inequalities that we have. This is part of the reason why we have a status quo, right? We're using old information, i.e. the past earnings, to try to inform the future, project the future earnings of this child. And in doing so, the status quo, of course, is racial and gender inequality. And of course, we are hard-coding that into our algorithms. And so there's some data from the Washington Post where they actually looked at some of these. I'll just give you the slides because I think you get the point as well. Okay, so one of the rules, the racialized rules that we have is that race corrections are necessary and standard practice. We do it in Table 1, we do it in our SAS code, we do it in our actuarial reports. We create vital statistics, people like you and I in this room. These numbers are picked up by life insurance companies, they're picked up in court settlements, and these lead to wealth inequalities, right? And as many of you I know are aware, the wealth accumulation by race is quite different, much more disadvantaged for people of color. Okay, so these racial algorithms reinforce the idea that race is an innate rather than socio-political construct, and they're evident in many fields, insurance, medicine, and so forth. And this brings us back to the Buckyball, right? It's not only until we start to understand that institutions are connected together, don't get me wrong, we need to continue to do the work at the individual level to understand microaggressions and hate crimes. We need to do more to understand the work of individual institutions like banking. But now I think as we move into the next generation of research, we really need to start thinking about the interconnections across these institutions. And the Buckyball I showed you was actually even not as complicated as you get. Here's another version of Buckyball, which is an endohedral fullerene, Buckyballs within Buckyballs. As you can see, the reality is much more complicated. And sort of a little fun fact is that one of the versions of Buckminster fullerene is the second most expensive material on the planet. The only thing that's more expensive than this version of a Buckyball is black matter. And so I want to thank you for your time, and I do look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. G. Wow. So you've given us a ton to think about, and I want to sort of open things up certainly for people to ask questions in the chat, or we also have a reasonable sized group that if someone wants to just raise their hand, we can invite you to verbally ask your question. I know it looked like in the chat also there's some people that have known you since you were a student at Hopkins, so they may want to say hello. I'm looking at you, Dr. Bowie. So, but certainly we want to open it up. I see. Okay, so I see one question already. This is from Dr. Jones. Good to see you tuned in, Dr. Jones.
Yeah,
did you want to ask your question? Do you want to
Yeah,
ask your
sure.
question right off? Okay.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I put this long question into the chat box, but I first wanted to start with thanks for such an insightful, amazing presentation. I learned so much. And it's really unfortunate that our literature is just scattered with a lot of these studies. And so one thing I was thinking moving forward, you know, a lot of the students that are coming up that have to rely on this prior literature to build upon it to improve health, you know, how do you advise your students to look with that critical eye? Because and even for faculty too, because some of the things that you said, I'm like, oh my gosh. So what are your thoughts behind that on how to move forward with a health equity lens?
Yeah, you know, I think the important thing is, and that I tell my students, right, is we got to read the primary literature, and we have to read everything with a critical eye, including the studies that are like the seminal studies, right? You know, obviously seminal studies are important for all of us to know, especially as students, because you want to know what has been very influential in your field. But I think, really want to take all of this research, you know, including the work that I do and everybody else, you know, with a critical lens. A lot of the older literature was not designed to think about equity, right? So, you know, like I tell my students, you know, like the health belief model, which is kind of this institution in of itself, right, was not designed to look at health inequities. And so for me, when I have a student that tries to health belief model race inequalities, I tell them that is not going to, you can't health belief model and save, you know, George Floyd, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So the old literature is important to know because as scholars, we should know, you know, kind of what our field has done and what it's been important at some point in time. But I think going forward, we really need to say, well, you know, if we're concerned about issues of equity and inequality, then we really need to think much more broadly than our literature has offered us. You know, I was very fortunate in the sense that, you know, I did my dissertation at a time when we didn't have Google, right? And I had to, you know, drag my butt to the library.
Yeah.
And when I was at the library, I just randomly looked at journals, and that article on redlining, I found by accident, right? So, you know, this goes back to algorithms. When students, they go to Google Scholar or Medline, they do a search on their topic. The first page is usually what we look at, and then we kind of absorb those, and they think, oh, okay, this is what we're going to do. But you're being fed information based on some computer algorithm that blinds you to other kinds of information. So I really advise students to just go to the library, get hard copies of stuff, and just flip through and read stuff you normally would not read. And accidentally, you might stumble upon something really cool. So yeah, I would do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good. So plug for the primary literature. Love it. Very important.
Yep.
Other questions?
So I have my hand up, Dr. Cruz.
Yes. Oh, I do see your hand. Yes.
Yes. Let me just first say I'm loving the red that you have on. At least that's what it looks like from my screen. And
Thank you.
I'm always inspired by Dr. Jones's questions. And, you know, I expected, as I said in the chat, nothing less from my colleague and longtime friend, Dr. G. So I want to just make one comment, and I don't know if this is necessarily a question per se, but I learned so much first and foremost from your presentation. These are sort of been, I think, truths that we've known, but it's always great to have the evidence to support them. And I think your response, Gil, if I might call you that, is to,
Absolutely.
yes, is to say, in addition to, how we stumble on things, and as you did when we used to have to go to the stacks in the Welch Library, what I have also found to be so useful for me is to step outside of the academy. And the more that we're engaged in the community, and also when we are joining with other partners, if you're joining with partners who are trying to address housing issues. I serve on the board of a community law center in Baltimore, who today in the paper has been able to sort of keep the tax sales from going forward so people don't lose their homes. It's just temporary, but these are the places where some of these other issues show up and where public health can have an influence, as well as those organizations and institutions becoming allies for us when we're trying to do their work. So I just wanted to make that comment. And then I think the other is sort of somewhere between a question and a comment, which is, many of us have been peeping, if not, glued to the television screen as we have watched our dear sister, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, actually go through some very harsh and reprehensible line of questions from some of the people who have been elected to represent the best interests of all Americans. As I have watched this, it has in some ways made me feel less confident and less hopeful of how we will break down these institutional barriers of racism and casteism, and how do we, close some of these gaps around wealth and all sorts of inequities. Because as we continue to have Senates and a Congress that looks like this current one, it's going to be an uphill battle. You also made a very strong case for why we need to have a judge like Ketanji Brown Jackson to be able to bring the perspectives and represent the diversity of opinions that are needed on this bench. So I just wanted to get your take on, how do you think people like Dr. Cruz and Dr. Ebe and Marsteller and Jones and everyone who is here, how are we going to be able to continue to do our work, ride this way, particularly as women of color, still in institutions that very much look like our Senate?
So I agree 1,000-fold with everything you said. At the very beginning, with your comment about getting research ideas and data and collaborations with people in the community and nonprofit and so forth, 1,000% agree with that. I actually I created a class a couple years ago on measuring structural racism, and the premise of the class is actually to have the students brainstorm manifestations of racism that have not appeared in the literature. Because I know my eyes are blind to a certain extent, the literature is definitely blind, but the students who have seen things or who have family members who have experienced things will be the next generation in some ways of seeing and measuring, testing, intervening, and making things better. So for me, that involvement of people outside of academics is so critically important. To the political space, it's very depressing in a lot of ways. And for me, if I were to think about one intervention that I would do that would have ripple effects, my intervention would be to eliminate gerrymandering. Because gerrymandering makes possible these hyper-segregated voting districts that make possible these echo chambers that are very polarizing, that make possible the composition of Congress, that therefore also help, figure out who sits on the Supreme Court and all the district judges and all that. We've also had sort of on the bench some changes in how we think about various entities. Like one of them, and I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but basically there's been some rulings that have really started to narrow what a definition of discrimination is, right? For many of us in this room, we have a complicated understanding, or more fuller understanding of discrimination. It's not necessarily individual prejudicial attitudes that are interpersonal, but the court has really started to narrow what is a hate crime, narrow the definitions of discrimination, and that's made it very problematic in a lot of ways for thinking about civil rights. And yeah, I mean, I think, if we can, change the composition of the Supreme Court, I think that's great. I think the conservatives understood this quite well, starting back in the Gingrich days. And I think this has been part of their long-term strategy, is to take over the courts. And I think that, us as members, broad members of the populace, we really need to really think hard about how we can elect officials that represent the very changing nature of American society. And I think it's this fear that America is changing that's generating a lot of the heated discussions as well. So hopefully that gets at some of your points.
Yeah, so, and thanks for that. So lots of energy in the chat, people thanking you for this really eye-opening talk that you gave, as well as sort of and thank you for the responses to your questions as well, to these questions so far as well. One I wanted to highlight, and maybe others we can get to here in a moment. I think it's Dr. Uzi. Forgive me if I mispronounced your name, but the question is around whether there are any particular methods that you think would be useful in investigations of the sort of multiple different contributors to, or institutions that are involved in structural racism, thinking about them simultaneously. And I know this is a little bit of a softball to you, because I know that you have many thoughts on this, but thought I would ask, thought we would raise up that.
Yeah, well, I think at the most basic level is we probably need to begin with some descriptive work, right? So, which institutions are connected to whom, like through formal trade agreements and so forth. Which corporations are getting funded, and how they talk to each other. I think also looking at more informal practices, I think are important. But I think one way to get started is to start focusing on one institution that you may know well, like banking or housing, and then to see what entities are connected to that institution, and then to kind of do a broad scope of the literature to see what kind of inequalities people are talking about, and then to see first about the basic things like the flow of money, but then also to do a deeper dive into the flow of practices, who is sitting on whose boards. So even if the corporations don't have formal arrangements, we know that people sit on different boards, and obviously that's very influential in that space as well. So there's lots of ways we could start plugging in. You could even start with individual people and then see what Bill Gates, and see well, he's probably on innumerable boards. But you could probably start to see that web of influence. And so there's, I think, a lot of different ways you could start to approach this from an analytical lens. Yeah, case
Great.
Studies also. Yeah.
Great. And I see Mr. Thomas, you have a question. Your hand's up there.
To just ask.
Mute. You're on mute.
You unmute yourself again. Okay.
I clicked it twice. I unmuted and then muted myself again. Thank you, Dr. Cruz. Yes, going back to that Hoffman study, is one example of the way the fullerene works is that study was criticized, interestingly enough, by, I think it was Kelly Miller at Howard, but also W.E.B. Du Bois. who wrote quite a systematic kind of treatise about how bad it was. And yet we don't hear about that. Those criticisms sort of disappear. Would that be, again, part of the nexus of all the dots that you were describing, that say in academia, post-Reconstruction academia, still the white influence?
Yeah, there was a study, I can't remember who did it, but they looked at race scholars, prominent race scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And a majority of the prominent race scholars in, I think, the field of psychology were white. Right, ironically enough, like Gordon Allport, a seminal figure in psychology of prejudice and so forth, but somewhat ironic, maybe not ironic, considering that he was Jewish, and of course we're writing that literature was developed on the heels of the world wars. But I think citation practices matter. I actually have a book that I'm finishing on how to be successful in publishing. But one of the things that I mention is citations are very important in terms of, obviously we know because we're all academics and we know how important citation practices are. But, on even very basic things like syllabi, where we, are not having students read new scholars of color, women. There's actually a movement, hashtag #CiteBlack Scholars, for example, that I think will help interject some new ideas. But, part of our citation practices and how we use the literature and how we ignore critical voices, I think is part of the function of racism and maintaining the status quo. And so, and sort of a different example of that I think is a really good model. There was a study it was published in AJPH. Oh gosh, I can't remember. Spencer Moore. I don't know if you guys read there was a paper by Spencer Moore where he talked about the concept of social capital in public health, and how most of the citations were going to a Kawachi who used the Putnam communitarian perspective on social capital. But in sociology, where the idea originated, there's actually sort of three major ways of thinking about social capital. But we in public health have decided, at least when Spencer's paper was published, that the communitarian, bowling alone perspective was the way to go. And he did this really nice sort of analysis of bibliographic citations, and they all kind of pointed back. I think we could do something like that to thinking about the influential articles on race. Certainly we have a bunch of heavy hitters like David Williams and Tom LaVeist and so forth. But I think it would be very interesting to replicate a study like that and to really remind ourselves that if we really want to change things, we should be doing a more concerted effort to cite people of color and also to cite junior scholars who really could use the recognition and credit. So.
Thanks for that. So still, I think I covered everyone in the chat, but feel free to, I see one more coming in. Notes of gratitude. And it looks like there's a question about the citation for what you just meant. Yeah, so Spencer Moore, I think that was AJPH, you thought?
AJPH.
AJPH.
Yeah.
For Spencer Moore. So I have a question regarding the Buckyball, which I was very sort of taken with. So this sort of Buckyball analogy. So one of our actual previous jam session speakers, Dr. Monica Peak, who you may know is at the University of Chicago, she talked a bit and pointed us actually to a podcast that I ended up listening to, but that highlighted that throughout the history of this country, when there has been progress with respect to social justice, that there tends to be significant sort of blowback afterwards, right? And so I was, in your analogy of the Buckyball, what was going through my mind was this idea of like when we sort of make a dent in the ball, the sort of blowback that comes back. And I was wondering if you might, give us thoughts about how, for those of us trying to even understand the full, buckyball, if you will, right, in terms of thinking about how these institutions interrelate. What should we be doing to even anticipate, what the blowback could be, prepare for, just really trying to think ahead. And certainly we're seeing examples of blowback right now, even in the setting of I think progress we think maybe has been made, at least around attention to social inequities and greater, even just people being more comfortable even naming racism in discussions across a number of different sectors. We're already seeing blowback, right? So just curious about your thoughts on that.
I think we need to anticipate that blowback, right? And this is true for any public health problem of significance, tobacco control, and even seatbelts, right? And you have, Andrea and lots of people that have had to, Andrea Gillen, who have, been part of those battles, right? Where at least when we are thinking about tobacco, we're facing one industry that's, of course, very powerful and very wealthy. But when we're talking about racism, then we're talking about the entirety of our country. And I think that's to be anticipated and expected that, and so I think in some ways, even as scholars, we've faced that kind of blowback. Those of you who, may have, been connected to me through Facebook and things like that, I almost never post. And the reason for that was some years ago, I was targeted by some extremist group, and I kind of knew that would happen because, like even now, like about 2.5 years ago, right? Not that many people were talking about racism in the health space. Nowadays, it's a bit more mainstream for sure, but just 2.5 years ago, pre-COVID, there's only a handful of people like seriously working in this space. And so one thing that happened, as I was talking and writing about, race, racism, and so forth, is I got targeted by these extremist groups. And the thing that really just kind of flipped me to just be silent on social media was they once took a picture of me and my child and posted it on their website. And I said, I'm fair game, but you guys are completely not cool to take my kid and, take a picture of my kid into this. So I just kind of shut a lot of things down on social media. But we got to expect those kinds of things as part of our work. To the extent that your university can provide a layer of protection, that would be useful. If we're doing advocacy work, we got to expect that and find ways to have compatriots that can, also not only kind of shield us and all that, but keep us in the fight for the long haul. Because one thing that my students, that happen a lot to my students, is they get really discouraged because everything seems so depressing. And I tell them, I've been doing this, for 20-something years, and for me, I just tell them that I do this because of both anger and love, right? And so for me, it's anger by all the bad stuff that's happening, but it's also love for the community. And so those two things, sometimes it's more anger, sometimes it's a little bit more, but those are the two things that just keep me going. In doing this work, because it's so much easier to do things that are less controversial. It really is, especially, you go back, 20 years, my dissertation was on discrimination against Asian Americans. When I did my dissertation, that was the Clinton years, right? And so I had some people say, oh, maybe you should work on healthcare reform and primary care and those things and do something more like real and legitimate than race and racism and Asians. Oh my God, like they're a model minority. Like you're crazy to do all that at that same moment in time. There were a handful of people. I have to give lots of people credit, like Tom Leviste and Janice and lots of other people that, were encouraging and all that. But yeah, so hopefully that kind of gets at some of your question.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, first of all, we are grateful for your courage, to do this work, and I think we've benefited from it here in this jam session today, and certainly the field has benefited from it. And your experience is something definitely that we hear from a lot of scholars in the space, that we're one of few, working in this area, and definitely it's taken a lot of courage to do so. I'm gonna offer people to use the hashtags anger and love, because I think we all relate to that as a motivation for this work. And I think there's really not much more to be said, I think on that note. So I want to invite everyone to join me in thanking you again for really just a tremendous talk today, and thanks so much for sharing with us.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. And by the way, I mean, I certainly, um, uh, I had my struggles, but definitely a lot of people blazed the trail, and there are a lot of people working in other spaces outside of health, right, that helped set the stage. So yeah. So, but this has been a lot of fun. I'm really thrilled to chat with all of you.
Thank you.
Next time in person for sure. You can bring
Yeah,
some
totally.
California sun
Yeah,
and
yes,
some SoCal sun.
that's right. That's right.
Great. Thank you again.
Thank
All right.
you.
Great to
All
see
right.
you, Gil.
Great to see you too.
Thank you.
All right.